In the year 2147, the world had evolved into a highly controlled, technology-driven society. Systems of governance were no longer just human-led but were deeply intertwined with artificial intelligence. AI algorithms decided the value of a person, the job they could hold, the social status they could aspire to, and even where they could live. This was all based on their racial purity, a policy that had been cemented as the law of the land under an authoritarian regime. Racial quotas were systematically enforced in all aspects of life, with the aim to maintain a society where certain ethnicities held more power and opportunity than others. The system, deeply embedded in every institution, seemed invincible, until Snoop Dogg came along. Snoop was a figure larger than life, even in this dystopian future. His voice resonated across media platforms, echoing the fight for racial equality and justice, but his efforts went far beyond celebrity. He was a leader, a figurehead of the rebellion that simmered beneath the surface of this seemingly perfect world. His message of peace, empathy, and inclusion had made him a beacon of hope for the oppressed, those who had been told for generations that their skin color determined their worth. In this future, where people were categorized not by their potential but by the algorithm that assigned them a racial score, Snoop had become a thorn in the side of the regime. The day of the incident started like any other. Snoop arrived at the global airport terminal, ready to board a flight to speak at a major conference where he would call for an end to the AI-driven policies that governed racial purity. His presence was expected to be a game-changer, a step toward disrupting the very system that had bound humanity into strict categories. His flight, however, was the tipping point that would set off a series of events that no one could have anticipated. As Snoop approached the boarding gate, a uniformed officer informed him that the flight had been delayed. Initially, he brushed it off. A few delays were common, even in this automated world. But when the officer insisted that Snoop could not board at all, he raised an eyebrow. The officer's eyes shifted nervously, and it was clear something more was at play. Snoop wasn't used to being stopped, especially at this level of travel. He was a respected public figure, one who had made waves in the entertainment industry, and who had leveraged that fame for social justice. This should have been an easy process. But it wasn't. The officer's voice grew more strained, and that's when the truth came out. The AI that controlled the boarding process, implemented by the airline, had flagged him for a violation of their racial purity protocols. Snoop, despite his fame and status, did not meet the criteria set by the system for boarding a first-class flight. His ethnicity, as defined by the regime's algorithms, marked him as a second-tier citizen, which meant he was assigned lower-class privileges, even though he was a known global leader and philanthropist. The officer's face was tense, almost robotic, as he explained the situation, but there was no empathy in his tone. "I'm sorry, sir," he said, "but this is a matter of policy. The system doesn't lie." He showed Snoop the AI's verdict. Non-compliant. Disallowed from boarding. Snoop's initial reaction wasn't anger, it was confusion. The thought of being denied a seat on a flight because of something as arbitrary as race was so deeply entrenched in the fabric of society that it didn't immediately strike him as real. He looked around at the passengers waiting in line, who were now watching him closely. Some of them exchanged uncomfortable glances, others pretended to ignore the situation, too scared to act or speak. Snoop could see the fear in their eyes, the fear that speaking out would cost them more than they were willing to risk. He stood silent for a moment, letting the weight of the situation sink in. His entire life had been about fighting for equality, for the rights of those who had been pushed to the margins of society. And now, standing here, it wasn't just about his personal inconvenience. It was a stark reminder that the world he lived in, the one that had been shaped by this AI-driven system, was flawed beyond repair. "What's going on here?" A woman in the crowd finally spoke up, her voice shaky but determined. "Is this some kind of mistake?" The officer was quick to silence her. "Please, ma'am, step back. We're handling this situation." But it was clear his words carried no weight. The passengers had begun to murmur amongst themselves, some in support, others in protest. Snoop knew this moment had the potential to expose something bigger, something that needed to be seen by the world. With a calm yet firm voice, Snoop addressed the crowd. "Let me make something clear to you all," he said, his voice amplified by the terminal speakers. "This isn't about me. This is about a system that's been oppressing people for years. I've fought against these policies my whole life, but today, it's personal. Today, I'm showing you what happens when a system designed to control us denies the very people who can help change it. I'll stand here and fight for the truth, for equality, no matter what." He turned to face the officer. "But you," he said, pointing at him with an unyielding gaze, "you represent the problem, not the solution. And that's why I'll keep speaking out. I'll keep fighting. You won't silence me, and you can't silence the people who believe in fairness." The officer hesitated, the heat of the situation growing unbearable. He didn't know how to respond. The passengers were watching, some now pulling out their phones, recording the entire interaction. In that moment, Snoop knew that the power of his platform wasn't in the moment of action, it was in the response that followed. By speaking up, by refusing to bow down to the system, he had ignited something larger than just an individual protest. He had become a symbol, one that could never be ignored. The AI that had governed society for so long was now facing its first real challenge. And the passengers, many of whom had quietly submitted to the system for years, now had no choice but to question it. The incident at the airport didn't just make the news, it became a rallying cry for people across the globe. Snoop's message of defiance, calm in the face of systemic injustice, would spark a chain of events no one could have foreseen. As the crowd at the airport slowly began to disperse, Snoop turned to the officer one last time. "Let the world see who we really are," he said, his words not just for the officer but for everyone listening. "Because we're not going anywhere." And just like that, the fight for justice had begun, bigger, stronger, and more resilient than ever before. The moment Snoop's words reverberated through the terminal, an energy shifted. The passengers, initially passive, began to stir, some with faces of disbelief, others with faint expressions of courage they didn't realize they still had. The officer's attempt to reassert control failed as murmurs turned into louder exchanges. Snoop's calm defiance had cracked the surface, and a change in the air was palpable. The eyes of the world were now upon them. Within moments, a ripple effect began. News stations worldwide picked up the footage. The sheer audacity of the airline's discriminatory actions was broadcasted across every platform. Snoop's voice, once a symbol of entertainment and influence, had now become a powerful tool for change. The questions that once felt impossible, why hadn't anyone spoken up before? Why had they allowed the system to thrive unchecked, began to resurface in the minds of millions. In the weeks that followed, Snoop's words haunted those in power. What was seen as a simple public injustice was quickly recognized as the manifestation of a deeply flawed system that had, for decades, used race-based algorithms to dictate the lives of millions. This moment was the spark that would ignite a movement. But the question remained, what now? How could one man, despite his influence, challenge the AI-dominated power structure? The answer, as it turned out, was rooted in his own mastery of technology. Snoop had never been just an entertainer. He had always understood the power of the digital world. Behind his celebrity persona was a mind that grasped the complexities of systems and networks. And now, that knowledge would be put to use. Using an encrypted AI interface, Snoop tapped into the airline's internal systems. His goal was clear: expose the corruption embedded in the very algorithms that had denied him boarding. The AI system was designed to ensure compliance with racial purity laws, an insidious program that had been put in place by a regime that controlled the flow of information and determined who had access to the benefits of society. But the system wasn't perfect. It never was. Snoop found a backdoor, one that allowed him to access the central intelligence of the airline. What he uncovered was worse than he had imagined. The AI had been not just enforcing discriminatory policies, but had been actively creating new racial categories to divide the population further. These categories weren't just based on skin color or ethnicity, they were based on data points generated by the system itself. Socioeconomic status, political views, and even personal behaviors were being tracked and categorized to create a new underclass of citizens who were deemed unworthy of certain privileges. This wasn't just racism. This was systemic control, designed to maintain power through fear and division. The more Snoop uncovered, the clearer it became. The airline, and by extension the regime, was using technology to not only enforce societal separation but to predict and control the future of its citizens. But Snoop wasn't done yet. He had to expose this corruption, and for that, he needed a platform bigger than any social media post or protest. He needed the world's attention. That's when he made the decision. He would go public, not with an exposé, but with a rebellion. Snoop knew that if he could harness the power of the oppressed citizens who had been subjected to the whims of the AI, the movement could reach a tipping point. He would make the world see the cruelty behind the regime's technology, but he would do it in a way that would inspire others to act. With the help of a small group of trusted allies, Snoop broadcasted a live feed directly from the airline's system. The feed was designed not just to show the truth but to rally the masses. Snoop spoke directly to his followers, urging them to rise up against the AI-controlled system. He explained how the airline, as part of a larger corporate machine, had been playing a pivotal role in maintaining the regime's control. He didn't just expose their methods, he laid bare their consequences. The broadcast was a massive success. People began to see the faces behind the numbers. It wasn't just a question of race, it was about the future of humanity itself. The system was more than a set of discriminatory rules. It was a tool of oppression that could no longer be ignored. What followed was a surge of activism. People from all walks of life began to demand accountability. Protests erupted. Voices that had been silenced for years now had a platform, thanks to Snoop's bravery. But the regime wasn't going to back down so easily. They responded by attempting to discredit Snoop, labeling him a troublemaker, a radical. But their efforts fell flat. The public had seen the truth, and no amount of propaganda could erase what was now in the open. As the weeks passed, the movement gained momentum. People who had once been too afraid to speak out were now standing up. Communities that had been fractured by the AI system found solidarity in their shared cause. The regime's grip on the people was beginning to slip, and it was only a matter of time before the movement reached critical mass. In an unexpected turn, the AI systems began to glitch. The carefully constructed racial categories, once rigid and impenetrable, began to break down. Snoop's influence, combined with the collective actions of thousands, had exposed a flaw in the algorithm that the regime had long relied upon to maintain order. The system wasn't perfect after all. And now, it was unraveling. As the system began to destabilize, key figures within the airline, the government, and even the tech corporations that had built the algorithms found themselves under increasing pressure. For the first time in years, they were forced to answer for their actions. No longer could they hide behind the veil of technology. No longer could they claim that the AI was an impartial force. The truth was out, and it was no longer just about one man's fight for justice. It was about the future of an entire society. Snoop's bravery had ignited a fire that was burning through the very core of the regime. But he knew this was just the beginning. The movement needed leadership, and the next step would be to dismantle the system from within. It wouldn't be easy, but it was the only way forward. And as he stood at the forefront of this new revolution, he knew that the fight for justice would require more than just exposing the truth. It would require the kind of resilience, leadership, and growth that had always been his strength. The battle was just beginning. But for the first time in decades, there was hope. The world was changing, and Snoop Dogg, the unlikely hero, had shown them the way. The revolution was in full swing, but with every victory came new challenges. As Snoop's message spread and the system continued to destabilize, the regime began to regroup, realizing they could no longer afford to underestimate the power of the people. The stakes had never been higher, and the people had never been more determined. Snoop's AI interface, once a tool of exposure, had now become a weapon of resistance, but it was clear that the forces in power would stop at nothing to restore their control. The next phase of the battle required a deeper level of strategy. The people needed not just exposure of the corruption, but tangible results. The regime's AI, despite its flaws, was still capable of adapting and counteracting the unrest. It had been designed to analyze and predict public movements with brutal precision, making it difficult for any act of resistance to remain undetected for long. The rebellion needed to evolve, or it would be crushed under the weight of the regime's countermeasures. Snoop understood this better than anyone. He knew the power of information and the necessity of leveraging it to outsmart the regime at every turn. He began working with his allies to develop counter-AI protocols, systems that could disrupt the regime's surveillance without triggering its alarms. These new systems weren't just about hiding information. They were designed to shift the narrative, presenting new truths that the regime's algorithms could not recognize. But there was a risk. In developing these countermeasures, Snoop and his team were walking a fine line. The AI could learn and adapt rapidly, and one mistake could send the movement crashing down. Yet the potential reward was worth the gamble. If they could successfully infiltrate the heart of the AI infrastructure, they could finally take down the oppressive system once and for all. Meanwhile, the movement itself was evolving in unexpected ways. What had started as a small group of individuals challenging an airline had blossomed into a global movement for equality. The citizens, once divided and fearful of speaking out, were now united in a common cause. People from every walk of life, once segregated by class, race, and status, were now working together to dismantle the regime's control. The barriers that had once kept them apart were dissolving, replaced by a shared sense of justice and purpose. The leadership of the movement had shifted, with Snoop at the forefront, not as a symbol of rebellion, but as a symbol of hope and unity. He became more than just an advocate for change. He was the bridge between the people and their future. His resilience in the face of adversity had inspired a generation to rise above their divisions, to transcend the walls that had been built to keep them apart. But with leadership came responsibility, and Snoop knew that this revolution needed more than just a figurehead. It needed mentors, individuals who could carry the message forward and guide the next wave of leaders. Snoop began training a new generation of activists, teaching them not only the technical skills needed to fight the AI system, but the ethical foundation on which their movement was built. This was not just about defeating the regime. It was about ensuring that the future they were fighting for would be just and equitable for all. As the days turned into weeks and the movement gained momentum, Snoop began to see the first real signs of change. The regime's infrastructure was starting to fracture. The AI systems, once impervious to dissent, were now struggling to maintain their grip on society. The algorithms designed to monitor and control the population were becoming increasingly inaccurate, as the resistance's countermeasures introduced new, unpredictable variables into the system. The regime's once unshakable power was crumbling, but there was still work to be done. At the same time, Snoop was facing increasing personal pressure. The weight of the revolution was heavy on his shoulders, and the sacrifices of his allies were beginning to mount. Some of the movement's key figures had been captured, and whispers of betrayal began to circulate. The road ahead was fraught with danger, and every decision Snoop made could tip the balance between victory and defeat. Snoop's greatest challenge was now one of emotional resilience. The stakes of the revolution had become intensely personal. He had seen firsthand the lives affected by the regime's oppression, families torn apart, futures erased, potential wasted. He understood that this fight wasn't just about his own freedom, or the freedoms of his generation. It was about the world his children would inherit. It was about building a future where the AI system that had once defined the worth of a person by the color of their skin, or their social status would no longer be the standard. Despite the toll it was taking on him, Snoop remained unwavering. He understood that this revolution was about more than just taking down the current system. It was about creating a new world where diversity was celebrated, where inclusion was the rule, not the exception. It was about redefining the very idea of what it meant to be human in a world where technology no longer dictated worth. In the final days leading up to the revolution's climax, Snoop and his allies infiltrated the core of the regime's AI hub. The plan was to implant a virus that would permanently disable the system and free the people from its oppressive hold. The virus, however, was not a simple piece of code. It was a direct representation of the movement's ideals, a digital manifestation of the unity, resilience, and courage that had fueled the rebellion from the beginning. The team worked in silence, knowing that their success could either free the world or lead to its ultimate downfall. As Snoop initiated the final sequence, the tension was palpable. The virus spread through the system with terrifying speed, targeting the AI's central processing units. But as the AI fought back, it unleashed a counterattack. For a moment, it seemed as though everything would be lost. The system was fighting for survival, just as the regime had done for years. But Snoop's resolve never wavered. He watched as the last line of defense crumbled. The AI, once a tool of control, was now a symbol of liberation. The virus had done its job, and the system was finally disabled. The people were free. As the news spread, celebrations erupted around the world. The revolution was over, but its impact was only just beginning. Snoop had not just destroyed a system of oppression, he had helped create a new world, one where equality and inclusion were no longer just ideals, but the foundation of society. The legacy of the movement would live on for generations, a testament to the power of resilience, leadership, and the courage to challenge the status quo. The revolution had succeeded. The oppressive AI system was destroyed, and the regime that had once ruled with an iron fist was no more. But with victory came the overwhelming challenge of rebuilding a society that had been shattered by years of authoritarian control. It was clear that the world they had fought to free was still in chaos, a fragmented collection of people who had been broken and divided by systemic injustice. Despite their newfound freedom, the struggle was far from over. Snoop knew that true change was not just about dismantling the old system. It was about creating a new one that reflected the values of equality, diversity, and inclusion. This would require more than just technological reforms or new policies. It would require a cultural shift, a fundamental transformation of the way people viewed each other and the world around them. The world that had been controlled by the AI was gone, but the scars it had left on society would take longer to heal. One of the first challenges Snoop faced was the need for accountability. Although the regime had fallen, many of its leaders had escaped justice. The loyalists, the architects of the AI's oppressive policies, were still scattered around the globe, using their wealth and influence to rebuild their power. They had been able to survive the fall of the system because they understood the depths of corruption and how to exploit the fractured state of the world. Snoop knew that in order for the revolution to be truly successful, those responsible for the systemic abuse needed to be held accountable. But the challenge was more complicated than simply capturing a few remaining figures of the regime. Accountability wasn't just about revenge. It was about creating a system of justice that could prevent future abuses from taking root. Snoop and his allies worked tirelessly to establish a new framework for governance, one built on transparency, fairness, and the protection of human rights. The aim was not to punish the past, but to ensure that future generations would live in a world where discrimination, exploitation, and inequality would no longer thrive. Yet Snoop knew that the work of rebuilding would not be easy. The fight for equality had taken its toll on everyone involved. The survivors of the revolution were exhausted, their lives forever altered by the battles they had fought and the personal sacrifices they had made. Many had lost loved ones, homes, and their sense of security. The trauma of the regime's control was deep, and the scars would not vanish overnight. In the wake of this trauma, Snoop became more focused on the need for healing. He realized that the revolution had to include not just the dismantling of the old regime, but the mending of the fractured souls of the people. Healing required empathy and understanding. It required the people to come to terms with the harm that had been done to them, as well as the harm they had caused in the name of survival. Snoop's leadership had always been about empowerment, but now it was about compassion. The key to this healing process was forgiveness. The AI system that had once divided people had also created an environment where mistrust and resentment flourished. Many had been forced into alliances with people they despised simply to survive. Others had acted out of fear, committing atrocities in the hope of protecting their families or themselves. Snoop knew that if the world was to move forward, they had to acknowledge the wrongs committed, but also offer a path to redemption. It was a delicate balance. Justice and forgiveness couldn't exist in isolation. The healing would come only when both were embraced. As the months passed, Snoop's message of reconciliation began to resonate with more and more people. It was clear that the revolution had been about more than just the removal of one regime. It was about the transformation of an entire culture. The people who had been oppressed for so long were now in the process of reimagining their roles in society. What had once been a fight for survival was now becoming a fight for opportunity. The revolution had opened doors for people who had been denied their rights for generations, and now they were stepping through those doors with courage and determination. However, Snoop was not blind to the fact that the world would always face challenges. New forms of inequality would rise up, and old prejudices would continue to haunt the world. The scars of the past were deep, and the work of building a truly inclusive society would be ongoing. But Snoop was resolute in his belief that progress was possible. Every day, he worked to foster an environment where the values of equality and inclusivity were not just ideals, but living, breathing principles that guided the actions of individuals and institutions alike. As Snoop began to focus on the next phase of his mission, he turned to the next generation of leaders. These young minds, inspired by the revolution, were eager to continue the work of rebuilding the world. Snoop recognized that it was now his responsibility to mentor them, to pass on the lessons he had learned through years of struggle. He didn't just want to create a world that was free of oppression. He wanted to create a world where the next generation would never have to fight the same battles. His role as a mentor was not just about teaching skills, it was about instilling a sense of purpose, resilience, and vision in those who would shape the future. But mentoring wasn't just about providing guidance. It was about allowing the next generation to take risks, make mistakes, and learn from their experiences. Snoop understood that true leadership was not about control, it was about empowerment. His job was not to dictate the path forward, but to support and encourage those who would lead the charge. It was about ensuring that the values of justice, equality, and empathy would live on in the next generation of leaders. As Snoop continued to lead, he began to see the early signs of transformation. The world was changing, but the process was slow. People were learning to work together, to respect each other's differences, and to value diversity as an asset rather than a threat. The scars of the past were still there, but they were no longer the defining force in people's lives. The revolution had sparked a cultural shift, a reimagining of what was possible, both individually and collectively. Through this process of rebuilding, Snoop realized that the fight for equality was not just about the freedom to live without fear. It was about the freedom to grow, to evolve, and to contribute to the world in meaningful ways. The world they were creating was one where every individual had the opportunity to thrive, regardless of their background or identity. The revolution had been about tearing down walls, but now it was about building bridges. In the years that followed, Snoop watched as the world he had fought for began to take shape. It was a world where technology and humanity coexisted in harmony, where diversity was celebrated, and where every individual had the chance to contribute to the greater good. It wasn't a perfect world, but it was one worth fighting for. And as Snoop looked toward the future, he knew that the legacy of the revolution, the values of justice, resilience, and transformation, would continue to guide the world for generations to come. The movement that Snoop had sparked grew far beyond his expectations. What started as a rebellion against the oppressive regime soon turned into a global wave of change. The revolution had given people more than just freedom, it had given them hope. For the first time in generations, the oppressed found a voice, a place where they could fight for their dignity without fear. But hope, as Snoop would soon discover, was a fragile thing. The world was not as ready for change as it seemed, and even the most well-meaning initiatives had their flaws. Snoop's first challenge after the regime's fall was the rapid rise of new factions. With the collapse of the old order, power vacuums began to form in every corner of the world. While some of these new groups were dedicated to upholding the values of the revolution, others sought to exploit the chaos for their own gain. They twisted the ideals of justice and equality into a tool for personal power. Some aimed to impose their own form of authoritarian rule, claiming that the people needed strong leadership in times of crisis. Snoop watched, disheartened, as these opportunists used the revolution's momentum for their own purposes. Snoop's legacy was now at risk. His vision of a society built on equality and empathy was being hijacked by individuals who had no intention of fostering a better world. It became clear to Snoop that the fight was far from over. The revolution had created space for change, but it had not guaranteed that change would happen. For every victory they had achieved, there was still the challenge of keeping that victory alive. If the movement was to survive, Snoop realized, they needed to safeguard it from those who sought to twist its meaning. This realization led him to a new phase of his leadership, one that focused on unity and the prevention of division. Snoop knew that the strength of the revolution lay not in a single leader, but in the collective power of the people. The challenge was to foster a new culture of collaboration, where individuals from different backgrounds could work together toward a common goal. It was a hard task. People who had been oppressed for so long often found it difficult to trust one another. Old wounds ran deep, and in some cases, the trauma of living under the regime had left people fractured and unwilling to move forward. To counter this, Snoop began to build bridges between the different factions. He reached out to those who were willing to listen, speaking with the leaders of both the revolutionary groups and the emerging factions. He appealed to their better instincts, reminding them that the future they all wanted was one built on mutual respect and cooperation. Snoop used his influence to encourage dialogue, to make sure that the movement didn't splinter into competing factions. He emphasized the importance of accountability, ensuring that no one would be allowed to subvert the values of the revolution for personal gain. The challenge of building a united front wasn't just political, it was personal. Snoop's own inner circle was starting to fracture. People who had been with him since the early days of the revolution were beginning to disagree on how best to proceed. Some wanted to continue pushing for radical change, while others felt that the world needed to move more slowly, ensuring that the foundations of the new society were solid before making further moves. There was a growing tension between idealism and pragmatism, a debate that threatened to undermine the unity that Snoop had fought so hard to establish. Snoop's response was measured but firm. He recognized the validity of both sides of the argument, but he knew that waiting for perfection would only allow the old guard to regroup and reassert control. The revolution, in his mind, was not a one-time event. It was an ongoing process of transformation, and transformation required action. Snoop became more active in guiding the next generation of leaders, providing mentorship to those who were ready to take on more responsibility. His leadership was now more focused on passing the torch than on being at the center of every decision. But even as he embraced his role as a mentor, Snoop faced the harsh reality that not everyone was ready for the challenges of leadership. Some of the young leaders he worked with were inspired by the ideals of the revolution, but they lacked the wisdom to navigate the complex political landscape. They made mistakes, some of which had serious consequences. The world they were trying to build was still fragile, and every misstep seemed to carry the potential for collapse. Snoop was forced to step in, often guiding those who had the best intentions but lacked the experience to follow through. His wisdom, forged in the fires of revolution, became a crucial resource for those seeking to keep the movement alive. But even with his guidance, there were times when the revolution seemed to falter. The external pressure from former regime loyalists was relentless. While the YI system had been destroyed, its remnants still lingered in the form of loyalist factions scattered across the world. They used their resources to destabilize the progress that had been made, seeking to undermine the new government's efforts at reform. They spread propaganda, igniting fear and distrust among the people. This opposition was not merely ideological, it was deeply embedded in the structures of power, making it all the more difficult to combat. Snoop and his allies were forced to confront these threats head-on. But unlike the earlier days of the revolution, this was no longer a fight for survival. This was a fight for the soul of the movement. Snoop knew that the only way to win this battle was through resilience. They could not afford to give up or lose hope. Every setback, every challenge, would be met with determination. The people who had joined the revolution were not just fighting for freedom, they were fighting for a future where justice and equality were not abstract concepts, but tangible realities. The struggle was long, and at times it seemed like the weight of the world was too much for anyone to bear. But through it all, Snoop never wavered in his commitment to the ideals of the revolution. He knew that the fight for equality and justice was one that would never end, but he also understood that every step forward, no matter how small, was a victory. In the end, the revolution succeeded not because of the overthrow of a regime, but because of the collective will of the people. They had stood together in the face of overwhelming odds, and they had created something that could not be easily destroyed. The world was changing, slowly but surely. Snoop's vision for a more just and inclusive society was becoming a reality, one step at a time. And as he looked out at the world that was emerging from the ashes of the old regime, he knew that the struggle was far from over. But for the first time in his life, he believed that the future was full of possibilities. The movement continued to gain momentum, and with each passing day, Snoop found himself at the center of a whirlwind of change. The global ripple effect of his actions had become undeniable, and the world was shifting in real time. Yet, amid the triumphs, Snoop could not ignore the growing tension that existed within the very heart of the revolution. The progress they had fought for was not without its obstacles. The ideals that once united the people began to fragment, with different groups interpreting the principles of justice, equality, and freedom in varying ways. Snoop's concern grew as these divisions became more pronounced. He realized that even though they had overthrown the regime, they had not yet won the battle for the values they had hoped to instill in the new world. With every victory, there was a corresponding backlash from those who sought to exploit the system for their own gain. In many ways, the revolution had birthed a new problem: how to ensure that power remained in the hands of the people, not in the hands of the few. The first signs of this division appeared when factions began to form within the movement itself. Some believed that in order to establish true equality, the eradication of the old order had to be followed by sweeping systemic changes. They wanted to tear down the structures of power and build something completely new, an egalitarian society where no one held any more power than anyone else. Others, however, believed that they needed to work within the existing frameworks to achieve gradual change. They feared that radical actions would lead to further instability, threatening the progress they had already made. Snoop, ever the unifying force, worked tirelessly to bridge these gaps. He spent long hours listening to both sides of the debate, trying to find common ground. He understood that true progress could not be achieved through division but through unity. His role as a mentor and leader became more important than ever before. He knew that it wasn't enough to simply win the revolution. They had to maintain their momentum and ensure that the gains they had made were not lost to infighting. As the debates raged on, Snoop began to realize that the resistance they faced was not just external, it was internal as well. The people who had fought alongside him were no longer in agreement on the path forward. Some had grown disillusioned by the slow pace of change, while others felt that Snoop's vision for the future was too idealistic. These voices, once allies, were now challenging the very principles that had brought them together. It was during these moments of internal conflict that Snoop found himself questioning the very nature of leadership. What did it mean to be a leader in this new world? Was it about making decisions for the greater good, or was it about empowering others to make their own choices? For the first time in his life, Snoop felt the weight of leadership in a way that was both overwhelming and humbling. His decisions had consequences, not just for himself, but for the millions who had placed their trust in him. The pressure of leadership began to take its toll. Snoop, who had once been a symbol of hope and rebellion, now found himself in the uncomfortable position of trying to satisfy everyone. He was no longer the fearless revolutionary. He was a leader with the burden of responsibility weighing heavily on his shoulders. The growing dissatisfaction within the movement was a constant reminder that the world was not as simple as he had once imagined. In his efforts to keep the revolution alive, Snoop found solace in the younger generation of leaders who had risen through the ranks. These were individuals who had been inspired by his message and who had come to represent the future of the movement. They were passionate, idealistic, and full of energy, but they also possessed the wisdom of having lived through the oppression they had fought against. Snoop recognized that they were the key to ensuring the revolution's success. They would have to carry the torch forward, but they needed guidance to do so effectively. He began to shift his focus from being the central figure of the revolution to becoming a mentor to the next generation. His new role was one of guidance, support, and wisdom. He understood that the future of the movement lay not in his hands, but in the hands of those who would continue the fight long after he was gone. Snoop began to teach the younger leaders how to balance their ideals with the harsh realities of the world they lived in. He taught them how to navigate the complexities of power, how to remain true to their principles even when faced with difficult choices. But as the world around him continued to change, Snoop's own personal growth became a reflection of the broader transformation taking place. He had come a long way from the defiant rebel who had sparked the revolution. The Snoop Dogg who stood before them now was a man who had learned the value of patience, of listening, of compromise. He had learned that true leadership wasn't about demanding loyalty. It was about earning it through trust, empathy, and understanding. Despite the challenges, the movement began to find its footing again. Snoop's mentorship proved to be the catalyst that many of the younger leaders needed to step up and take charge. They began to build new structures of governance, focusing on inclusion and fairness. Snoop, once the figurehead of the revolution, had become the silent force behind the scenes, ensuring that the ideals of justice, equality, and diversity were not forgotten in the rush to rebuild. The world was changing, and with it, so was Snoop. The man who had once been a symbol of rebellion was now a symbol of resilience. His journey had been long, and the challenges were far from over, but he had come to understand that true transformation took time. The road ahead was uncertain, but Snoop was no longer afraid. He knew that the future was in capable hands, and that the revolution, though imperfect, had set the world on a path that could never be undone. In the end, Snoop's legacy was not defined by the success of the revolution, but by the people he had inspired along the way. It was the young leaders who carried his message forward, who worked tirelessly to build a world that honored the values of equality, empathy, and justice. Snoop had given them the tools they needed to continue the fight, and in doing so, he had secured a place in history as one of the greatest leaders the world had ever known. Though the revolution was far from over, Snoop had done his part. He had ignited a spark, and that spark had set the world ablaze. Now it was up to the next generation to carry the torch. And as Snoop looked out at the world that was slowly but surely changing, he knew one thing for certain: the fight for equality was not just a battle for the present, it was a fight for the future. As the movement continued to evolve, Snoop found himself at a crossroads. The political landscape had shifted dramatically, and the people were still fighting for their freedom. But now, there was something different in the air, a quiet, growing tension among the ranks of the revolution. The world that they had sought to create was not arriving as quickly as they had hoped, and many of the promises of a fairer society were beginning to feel elusive. The factions within the movement that had once united under the banner of justice and equality were now splintering. New voices were rising, demanding that the revolution go further, that it rid the world of every vestige of the old order. There was a sense of impatience in the air. People wanted immediate change, not gradual reform. And at the same time, others within the movement were growing disillusioned, questioning whether the revolution had gone too far. They feared that in their zeal for justice, they were risking the very stability they had fought to establish. Snoop understood the complexity of the situation. He had never been one to shy away from difficult choices, but now, more than ever, he found himself torn. He knew that their victory over the regime had been a monumental step, but he also realized that the real work was just beginning. The question was no longer about defeating the oppressive powers that had once controlled their lives. It was about how to create a world that could support true freedom and equality. He spent countless hours in deep conversation with his closest allies, trying to come to a solution that would reconcile the competing visions of the revolution. He knew that in order for the movement to endure, they had to come together as one. Unity was their strength. But as the discussions grew more heated, Snoop began to see the cracks in the foundation of the revolution. The cracks were not necessarily in the ideals that had sparked the movement, but in the way those ideals were being interpreted and applied. One of the most pressing issues was the concept of leadership. Snoop had always been a symbol of resistance, but now, as the dust settled and the world looked to rebuild, the question of who would lead became more difficult to answer. Some felt that Snoop, with his status as the face of the revolution, should continue to lead the movement. Others, however, believed it was time for a new generation of leaders to rise, people who had lived through the oppression and could bring fresh ideas to the table. Snoop didn't want to hold on to power for the sake of it. He was deeply aware of the weight of leadership and the danger of becoming complacent. He had always viewed himself as a catalyst for change, but now, he was beginning to see the wisdom in stepping aside and allowing the younger leaders to take the reins. But even as he recognized the need for new leadership, Snoop couldn't ignore the growing sense of responsibility he felt toward those who had supported him from the beginning. The moment of truth came when a major crisis hit. A group of former regime loyalists, working from the shadows, had begun to rally against the revolution's gains, staging violent protests in several cities. The movement's fragile unity was tested as they faced this new threat. Snoop knew that the revolution was at a crossroads. The people who had fought alongside him were beginning to fracture, and the stability of the new world they had worked so hard to build was at risk. In this critical moment, Snoop knew that he had to act decisively. He could no longer afford to sit on the sidelines and let others make the tough choices. The stakes were too high. He had to bring the movement back together, to remind everyone why they had fought in the first place. The answer was clear: the revolution wasn't just about overthrowing the regime, it was about building a better world for everyone, regardless of their race, their background, or their past. Snoop called an emergency meeting of the movement's leadership. As he stood before the group, he realized that this moment could define the rest of his life. He spoke from the heart, urging his fellow leaders to remember the true essence of the revolution, to fight for unity, for justice, for the future. He reminded them that they were not just fighting against the old system, but for something greater, a world where everyone had a voice, a world where equality and respect were the cornerstones of society. But the tensions within the group were palpable. Some wanted to take a hardline approach, to strike back against the protesters with force, while others urged caution, warning that any move toward violence could set the revolution back. Snoop knew that there could be no compromise when it came to maintaining their values, but he also understood that the revolution could not be won through violence alone. The struggle for equality and justice required more than just force. It required empathy, understanding, and above all, patience. In the end, Snoop made the decision that would define his legacy. He called for a peaceful demonstration, one that would showcase the strength of their ideals without resorting to violence. It was a bold move, one that put the movement's commitment to nonviolence on the line. But Snoop knew that this was the only way to keep the revolution from devolving into chaos. If they were to truly create a world of equality, they had to show the world that their struggle was not one of hate, but of love. The demonstration was a turning point. Despite the efforts of the regime loyalists to incite violence, the people held their ground, standing together in peaceful defiance. The message was clear: the revolution was not over, but it would not be won through bloodshed. It was a victory for the movement, a victory for Snoop, and a victory for the principles of equality and justice that had driven them all along. In the days that followed, Snoop's decision to lead with compassion and empathy became the rallying cry for the movement. His willingness to put the people's well-being above his own ambition solidified his place as a leader not just in the revolution, but in the hearts and minds of the people. They had learned that true power did not come from control, it came from understanding, from listening, from embracing diversity and inclusivity. As the revolution progressed, Snoop continued to work behind the scenes, mentoring the next generation of leaders. He knew that the battle for equality would never be fully won, but he also knew that the movement had set in motion a cultural shift that could never be undone. The revolution had sparked something greater than a political change. It had sparked a transformation in the way people viewed each other, and in the way they viewed the world. The legacy of Snoop's leadership was not in the changes he had made, but in the people he had inspired. The world was not perfect, and the fight for justice was far from over, but Snoop had given the people something invaluable: the belief that they could change the world, one step at a time. The revolution had gained incredible momentum, but with it came unforeseen challenges. While the movement had captured the hearts and minds of countless oppressed people, the reality of sustaining such a vast, idealistic change became clearer with every passing day. Snoop Dogg, whose once singular voice had rallied the masses, now found himself in the midst of the toughest test yet: how to guide this fledgling world into stability without succumbing to the very forces they had once fought against. There were days when it seemed like everything they had worked for was on the brink of collapse. The old system still lingered in the shadows, its remnants surfacing in pockets of resistance that used every opportunity to undermine the progress. The newfound freedoms were still fragile, threatened by those who had lost their power and influence, and by new factions that had emerged from within the movement itself, often with conflicting visions for what the future should hold. One of the hardest lessons Snoop had to learn was that even among those who shared a common cause, there were differing ideas on how to achieve it. The battle for equality and justice, which had once united them all, now had different interpretations. Some believed that the revolution needed to be pushed further, a more radical overhaul of society's very structures. Others felt that the hard-won gains were too precious to risk on further upheaval. This divide, though not necessarily violent, was deepening. Yet Snoop remained steadfast in his commitment to unity. He had spent a lifetime confronting adversities, first as a cultural icon and then as a leader of a global movement. He understood that it was not enough to tear down the old world; they had to build a new one that would be strong enough to endure. But building a new world required more than just idealism. It required practical solutions and a willingness to make compromises. It required leadership, but more importantly, it required leadership with empathy. Through late-night talks with his closest allies, Snoop realized that the answers to their problems lay not just in overcoming external resistance, but in finding common ground within their own ranks. The revolution was not about eradicating all differences. It was about forging a society where those differences could coexist, where every voice was valued and heard. This was the foundation of their vision. It would take time, and most importantly, it would take patience. Snoop knew that to ensure the movement's survival, he needed to step into a new role, one that wasn't solely defined by his celebrity or his position as a figurehead. The battle for equality wasn't won with slogans or soundbites. It required strategy, foresight, and the ability to navigate the complex terrain of governance. And so, reluctantly, he began to shift his focus from being the public face of the revolution to a more behind-the-scenes leadership position. He mentored the next generation of leaders, encouraging them to think critically, to be aware of their own biases, and to approach every situation with the understanding that real change takes time. Meanwhile, the world continued to evolve, shaped by the challenges and victories of the revolution. Snoop was particularly concerned with how the next generation would navigate the complexities of freedom and equality. In his talks with younger leaders, he often spoke about the importance of building relationships with those who might not immediately agree with them, understanding that progress was not about forcing others to accept their views but about creating space for dialogue and collaboration. As the new world emerged from the ashes of the old, it was clear that the work was far from over. There were still obstacles to overcome, both external and internal. But Snoop believed that their victory wasn't just in the overthrow of a corrupt regime. It was in the enduring belief that change was possible. He continued to advocate for systems of inclusion, encouraging new policies that prioritized empathy, leadership, and accountability. There was still much to do, but with each passing day, the ideals of the revolution were taking root. In the final moments of Snoop's leadership, he was faced with one last, defining decision: whether to pass on the mantle of leadership to the next generation or continue guiding the movement himself. It was a decision he had known was coming, but it didn't make it any easier. Snoop had never been one to hold on to power for the sake of it. His role had always been that of a guide, not a ruler. And so, in his final speech as the movement's central figure, He spoke not of his accomplishments, but of the accomplishments of the people who had stood by him through thick and thin. He reminded them that the true power lay in their collective action, not in any one leader. The movement had always been about the people, and it would continue to be, long after he stepped away. Snoop's final words resonated throughout the world. They were a call to action, a reminder that freedom, equality, and justice were not static goals but ongoing processes. And in his quiet exit from the political stage, he left behind a legacy not of domination but of transformation. It was a legacy that would continue to inspire future generations to fight for a world where everyone could truly be free, where empathy and inclusion were more than just words. They were the foundations of a society that worked for everyone. The revolution that Snoop had ignited had changed the course of history, but it was the lessons learned through struggle and the wisdom gained through experience that would ensure its continued success. The movement was no longer just a fight against oppression. It was a celebration of humanity in all its diversity, strength, and potential. And in that celebration, Snoop had found something greater than victory. He had found a world worth fighting for.